Welcome everyone to this remarkable event. Before we begin, please join us in a moment of silence for the 45 victims of the tragedy late Thursday night on Mount Meron in northern Israel. Yehi Zichram Baruch. May their memory be for a blessing. 50 years and 3 days ago, dozens of young people took over the San Francisco Jewish Federation in a protest sit-in over Jewish education. I was one of them. My name is Bradley Burston, and today it's my privilege to introduce a number of groundbreakers and innovators and instigators in Jewish education, many of them veterans of Berkeley's Radical Jewish Union, which staged the sit-in. A note to all our speakers, please keep to your allotted times. We will be ruthless. It seems only fitting to begin with one of the key instigators of the protest sit-in, an educator, an entrepreneur, a think tank member. Here with Why We Sat In is Shelley Schrader.
Good evening. In the turbulent 1960s and 70s, a post-World War II American generation rose up in inner cities and on college campuses in protest against racism and the war in Southeast Asia. A youth-centered counterculture challenged basic values and norms of dress, behavior, and culture. The University of California at Berkeley played a trend-setting role in these developments, starting out with the free speech movement in 1966 and feeding into the broad diverse movement known as the New Left. Not surprisingly, young Jews were prominent participants and leaders in these trends. Some sought to combine their Jewish and political identities, influenced by Zionist or synagogue schools, youth movements, and summer camps, or by Israel's victory in the 1967 Six-Day War, or by the campaign to free Soviet Jewry, or by the liberation movements of American blacks and Chicanos. Here's the key point. We considered ourselves the Jewish wing of the New Left and the revolutionary component of the Jewish community, the two at the same time. On many campuses, Jewish students formed groups to defend Israel and Zionism from vilification and published newspapers to spread their critical views of American society and of Jewish life. In April 1968 in Berkeley, Sid Strauss, a young psychology postdoctoral student, organized one of the first Freedom Seders with the enthusiastic participation of Eldridge Cleaver. In January 1969, Strauss initiated the first issue of the Jewish Radical, a newspaper which other students continued for years afterward. In 1969 and 70, they crystallized into a group called the Radical Jewish Union, RJU, and gave serious thought to bringing the revolution home to internal issues of the American Jewish community. We saw that community and its leadership as eager participants in much of what was wrong with America, in its consumerist self-satisfaction and smugness, in its complicity with the American ruling class in waging imperialist wars abroad, and not coincidentally, in assimilation to its cultural norms as an integral part of its hot pursuit of success and status. I sound a little bit like Philip Roth, but that's what it was. This required erasing conspicuous Jewish traits as if to convince America that Jews were really no different than anyone else, except for certain holidays and vestigial gastronomic preferences. Jewish education was clearly a low priority in this program, useful for general purposes, but not to the point of making people too Jewish and thereby less capable of full integration into the great American melting pot. What that means is we had stumbled upon the critical and potentially subversive role of education, a key battleground in all civil and communal struggles. The largely assimilationist leaders of the San Francisco Jewish Federation were refusing to allocate any support for Jewish day schools, which they regarded as too parochial and separatist, and in fact, an obstacle to their goal of making it in America. They ignored our advocacy of a different model of American Jewish identity in which day schools could play a pivotal role. This led to a group of 45 of us Berkeley Jewish students entering the Federation offices on Friday, April 30th, 1971, almost 50 years ago to the day, and staging a nonviolent protest sit-in to dramatize the issue of communal support for Jewish day schools. Sherman Rosenfeld has described the details of that memorable Shabbat in the spring 1971 issue of the Jewish Radical, which is referenced elsewhere on this site. We set out to expose and embarrass the Federation leadership for their denial of support and distributed detailed press releases to the local media. We came armed with all the trimmings required for celebration of Shabbat. Federation leaders were amazed that a bunch of Berkeley longhairs, yes, we were longhairs in those days, cared about day school Jewish education, a minor issue in their perception. Amazement turned to outrage, and they threatened to have us all arrested for trespassing. We stayed cool and politely informed them that there was nothing wrong with a group of young Jews coming to make Shabbos at the central address of the organized Jewish community. They wisely realized that we had scored our public relations points and were not intending to cause any damage or indeed stay for very long, and they therefore retreated very unhappily. We spread white sheets out on the large boardroom table at Federation. We laid out all the provisions we had brought with us, and we celebrated one of the most joyous Shabbat evening meals of our lives with kiddush, singing, and dancing. At one point, a middle-aged man with a kind, friendly face and a small beard showed up. He happened to be in town, had heard of our initiative in the media, and wanted to celebrate Shabbat with us. We welcomed him. He gave a couple of cool drashot on the Parashat HaShavua, and he sang with us. The man was Rabbi Wolf Kelman, a key leader of conservative Judaism, a precious Jew and a beautiful mensch. He was clearly signaling to us that there was a part of the so-called Jewish establishment which not only did not oppose our actions, but wholeheartedly validated and supported them. In truth, we already knew that. Indeed, the costs of publishing the Jewish Radical were long subsidized, very discreetly, through two professional leaders of the Oakland Jewish community, Oscar Minzer and Seymour Fromer. We folded our tents and returned to Berkeley by the end of Shabbat, and Federation did begin allocating support to the day schools. Our single action did not engender revolutionary change in the Jewish community or its leadership, and it would be naive to imagine otherwise. But it did constitute more of a symbolic milestone than I realized, as references to it over the years have demonstrated. It certainly impacted the consciousness of all of us who took part in it. Bradley.
Thanks very much, Shelley. Next on the program is a series of conversations. One warning in advance, each of these topics easily deserves a program all to itself. But it's fair to assume that each of these conversations will lead to many more in the future. If you have questions for any of the speakers, please make a note of them and save them for the question and answer session toward the close of today's program. And you'll also find resource materials available later this week on the Hamakom event page. So the first of our conversations will address school-age Jewish education. Our participants will be Peg Sundell and Sherman Rosenfeld. Peg Sundell heads Brandeis Marin, a K-8 Jewish day school in San Rafael, California. Rethinking the Jewish day school education for the 21st century. Sherman Rosenfeld came to live in Israel in 1982 and spent his career working on science education, both formal and informal, at the Weizmann Institute and in other contexts. Peg and Sherman, please.
So it's a great pleasure to be here. And I have to say, it's a great pleasure to meet Peg. I wouldn't have met her, I suppose, otherwise. And it's just amazing what work she's doing in Marin. I thought I'd start off with just a little bit of my background in the sit-in and then how it evolved into my present work. So I was the San Francisco City Director of Young Judea HaShachar for San Francisco. I was also living with David Beal on top of a place called Hot Dog. And my background in Jewish education wasn't that great in the formal sense. I went to Hebrew school for 9 years, but I have to say that those 9 years were relatively meaningless, non-compelling, and irrelevant in terms of the experience I had. What really saved me in terms of my Jewish identity were the summers I had at Camp Ramah, and then my work with Young Judea HaShachar, particularly as a madrich and so forth. And that's connected, I suppose, to the sit-in because it was a real seminal event in the sense that it brought us together on an issue that was really critical and crucial. I think that the connection between social justice and education has not been talked about enough, but I felt it very strongly, and it's something that's motivated me. And perhaps a short story will suffice, and I'll pass this on to Peg. When I was in Israel and I was working as a science educator, and I went into science education largely because of my interest in education. It was a period of time when it looked like that peace in the Middle East was definitely possible. And I spoke to my, at that time, junior high age daughter, Adi, who's now a teacher herself. And I said to her, you know, if you can imagine, there may be peace someday in the Middle East. And if that's the case, can you imagine school might someday be meaningful and enjoyable for students? And she gave me a puzzled look. Dad, she replied in a tone of exasperation. She said, you've got to be kidding. Peace in the Middle East, maybe, but students actually enjoying learning and school, never. And with that, I would like to, pass this on to Peg, who has a pedagogical approach, which I think is very, very promising and something that I use as well. Peg.
Thanks, Sherman. And I have to say that meeting you has been such a joy and a thrill for me. And I only realize now that I probably owe at least this stage of my career to you, understanding that in the spring of '71, Federation was considering closing, or at least was threatening closing Brandeis. And so I guess I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for the efforts of the Radical Jewish Union. And just to contextualize where that sit-in eventually led, or what it's contributed to, is that Jewish day schools, K-12 Jewish day schools, there are 11 Jewish day schools across the Bay Area. That's everywhere from Los Gatos to San Rafael, all the way over to Sacramento, 2 high schools, 9 elementary/middle schools, 9 community day schools, 2 Orthodox day schools, and then a smattering of other smaller Orthodox institutions cropping up. And, you know, Sherman, when you say that your Jewish education was rather unmeaningful, uncompelling, and felt irrelevant to the other segments of your life, I would say that's precisely where we are aiming our education, is to elevate those particular aspects of the Jewish tradition and to that have a meaning and that are compelling and relevant to the rest of students' lives, and to create a curriculum that seeks to integrate Jewish concepts, in particular social justice concepts, but not only social justice concepts, with what they're learning elsewhere. Let me just give you two examples. One is that we're looking at concepts like machloket, right? The idea of a disagreement for the sake of heaven. That through looking at things from multiple perspectives, we can be elevated in our perspective on something. We're using that not only in the realm of Jewish learning, we also, probably all of us here understand that to be an approach to studying poetry. We're also using that to help students understand mathematics and to uncover their mathematical thinking, getting them to think about not just the answer to a mathematical problem, but also to thinking about and talking about the various ways in which problems in mathematics can be solved. Another brief example would be looking at social justice impulses within the Jewish tradition to care for those who are most vulnerable in our society. Our students in middle school study homelessness as a problem throughout the Bay Area with rising, cost of living here, and they're looking at homelessness as a phenomenon. They're studying the Jewish tradition's impulse to help the homeless and the vulnerable, and then they're in their design lab class, which is sort of like a contemporary artificial intelligence infused shop class from maybe some of our education. And they're learning how to build tiny houses and exploring both dimension, building, and fabrication as potentially one piece of a multifaceted solution to a multifaceted problem. And I'll just say one other thing, and that is, perhaps inconceivable in those days, our school is attracting non-Jewish students. We have Muslims, Hindus, Christians, unaffiliated, LGBT, multi-generational families. And one of the things that attracts all those non-Jewish folks to our school is this reservoir of shared values that resonate deeply across religious boundaries. And I understand, Sherman, that kind of pluralistic education is happening in Israel. Can you say more about that?
Well, our time is running down. I can say that we have a list of some of the places that this takes place. Suffice it to say that there are many groups in Israel that are pushing towards pluralistic education, both in terms of combining religious and non-religious, Arab, Israeli, Gesher El Havadi, for those who knows about that. We don't have much time left, but there are those kinds of formats, and I'll leave it for the people to look at the resources we have. But I would like to ask you one last question, which has to do with, can you imagine if there would be a sit-in today for funding for Jewish education?
Olavai. And what a difference it would make. I mean, I can't even imagine anything about what you all accomplished in 1971 happening today, from sitting in on behalf of Jewish day schools to observing a full 25-hour Shabbat. But I would say that the power of Jewish day schools is pretty incontrovertible and supported by a lot of research that shows even though less than 5% of Jewish students attend Jewish day schools, those kids go on to comprise 40% or more of Jewish communal leadership in this country. And that specifically has impacted the non-Orthodox sector. So your work has had deep and profound ripple effects, and on not that I can speak on behalf of Jewish day schools, but thank you for your work and your passion.
Well, with those kind words, back to you, Brad.
Thank you so much, Peg and Sherman. Here are some slides for your edification and pleasure. Okay, our next conversation deals with Jewish summer camps and teens. Ken Bob, president of the Amenu Progressive Zionist Organization, was closely involved with summer camps as the head of the Habonim youth movement. Deborah Newbrin was director of Camp Tawonga for 24 years, launching innovative programs for LGBTQ families and Jews of color. Diane Birnbaum was for 33 years the director of Midrashah in Berkeley, an innovative program bringing together teenagers from local synagogues. Please.
Thank you, Bradley. I'm going to kick things off. It's great to be part of this sort of combination of walk down memory lane and really great program about an important subject. So this summer will mark 56 years that I've been involved with Jewish summer camping as a camper, a counselor, a camp director, a shaliach, a funder, and a cheerleader. And with that as background, I want to share a few words about the impact of Jewish camping on Jewish identity, leadership, and activism. Although we probably all intuitively know what I'm about to say, I also have data to back it up, beginning with a study entitled Limud by the Lake, which was commissioned by the Foundation for Jewish Camp in 2001. And that study was based on field observations at 18 Jewish camps across the United States, including those run by religious organizations, Zionist movements, community agencies, foundations, and private owners. And I'm going to quote sort of the money quote from the report. The fun of camp makes campers open and available to Jewish practices that they might scorn at home. The intensity of camp creates intensity around Jewish life. The separation of camp from the outside world and the close-knit quality of the camp community make it possible to live Judaism at camp in a total, holistic fashion. Judaism is lived as a matter of course at camp and takes no extraordinary effort. In short, the near-perfect match between what camping offers and what is needed to create a compelling Jewish youth world is striking. As one camper told the interviewers, you don't have to give up anything to do Jewish life when you're at camp. And the research showed that it was true for campers and for staffers. In fact, in a 2019 survey of Camp Tawonga staff conducted by the Foundation for Jewish Camp, 90% of those staff members reported their experience at Jewish camp has positively affected their Jewish identity. Now, moving briefly to the topic of leadership development, I recall in the early days of the Foundation for Jewish Camp, we published a brochure for high school guidance counselors on why being a summer camp counselor was more valuable than many summer internship opportunities. And the recent Tawonga research report stated it well, and I'll quote again. While working at camp, young people grow in extraordinary, multifaceted ways, learning to be leaders and role models. For example, as well as how to be creative and help others bridge cultural gaps and other divides. And it goes on, but you can get the feeling of what they were trying to do. Now, my experience in the Habonim youth movement camping took those words to another level. Based upon the youth leading youth concept celebrated by the classical Zionist youth movements, at the age of 20, I was selected as the director of the movement's 8-week leadership training camp, only 3 years older than 80, 16, and 17-year-old participants. My 3 summers as director, joined by several people on staff who are participating in this program today, were indeed magical for both staff and campers. Jewish community was created, education took place, leaders were developed, commitment to activism was ignited, and lives were changed. Now, I'm going to close with a comment about how this connects to the activism in the RJU. In preparation for this session, I asked members of our RJU alumni listserv about how their summer experiences impacted their activism. I received responses that covered attendees at Ramah, the Conservative Movement's camp, Reform Movement camps, Habonim, Hashomer Tzair, Young Judea, Brandeis Bardeen, and Masad in Canada. And the respondents wrote about being impacted by counselors who are active in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, about how youth movement education brought them to left-wing Zionism and Aliyah. They confirmed that particularly as staff members, the intellectual and ideological communal engagement motivated their activism. I don't know about anyone else, but I'd go back to camp in a heartbeat. And I welcome you to put into chat if you want to shout out your own camp. Deborah, you next?
Deborah, we can't hear you.
We cannot hear you.
You cannot hear me.
Yeah, Ken.
Now we can.
We can't.
There you go.
Here we go. All right. So thank you, Ken. And I was camp director at Camp Tawonga starting in 1984 to 2006. So for 24 years, I was in the camping world. I want to talk specifically about the work that I had some influence in on sexual behavior at camp, LGBTQ inclusion, and Jewish ecology and nature education. And to do that in 2 minutes, I'm going to talk fast. I want to say that when I came into camping in 1985, it was through Jewish nature education. I'd been a ranger, and I'll get to that soon. But in 1985, the AIDS epidemic was rampant, and the first conference I went to in 1985 was at Grossinger's, of all of the camps from the JCC movement and some of the other and some of the reform movement camps. And they were saying, yeah, we tell our staff they can't have sex at camp. And we were saying, in California, we were out here and we had just bought thousands of condoms from Good Vibrations because we started a responsible sex education conversation for the staff and consent culture for the staff. And then we put condoms in the staff lounge. And camps around the country weren't doing that. And we were saying, how can you not do that in the age of AIDS? So that was something that we took the lead on. Now every camp in the country does some sort of version of that. The other thing that we did was we started boys and girls campfires so that we could talk about what does it mean to be a Tawonga man? What does it mean to be a Tawonga woman? And then since I've been there, they've now have gender nonconforming campfires. So children can decide, I'm going to the men's campfire, the women's campfire, or the gender nonconforming campfire. When I was a young lesbian in my 20s, I was the first resident camp director that I knew of that came out of the closet. That includes all the Girl Scout camps where there was lots of lesbians running those camps, I'm sure. And the issue I had is I had young babies and we were never in the majority. My wife was a rabbi. We were mostly in the straight world, and we needed to be in the majority just once a year, just for a weekend. And so we started an LGBTQ family weekend 20 years ago with 15 families. It regularly runs with 70 families, and lots of more families have, the LGBTQ community has changed. So now we see more dad-headed families. We see straight parents with gender nonconforming kids all coming together in a space like that. We were the first in the country, in the Jewish world, to offer something like this. And finally, coming into Jewish education, coming into Jewish learning through Jewish education. I grew up at Beth Shalom, had my bat mitzvah, quit Jewish learning, and then had the good fortune to meet Rabbi Stu Kalman and Vicky Kalman, joined their Jewish education for Jewish professionals. My Jewish learning went up tremendously, and Stu and I had the ability to travel the country and introduce Jewish educators, mostly women who were supplementary Jewish educators, to Jewish learning. And I got to do the Jewish nature part. I had been, as I said, I'd been a ranger, I'd been a naturalist. And so it was through doing all of that learning that I ended up putting Judaism and ecology together. And that's kind of my story.
So I guess I'm next, talking about Midrashav, which was an intercongregational program for Jewish teens. And the segue is that we sort of tried to take that good feeling from camp in the summer and bring it to the school year. And I tried to think of what made Midrashav radical and came up with three things. The first was that it was both intercongregational and open to the unaffiliated. Midrashav started about 5 years before I moved to, or more than that, before I moved to Berkeley, started in the late 60s with the help of Seymour Fromer, who you've already heard about, and who was leading a thing called the Jewish Education Council, and lay people like Ernie Alexander. And the idea was to combine students from different congregations so that no one by themselves would have a critical mass, but together they would have great education. So there was the Midrashah in Berkeley for 7th to 12th graders. There was a tiny one in Fremont. And then there was something called the East Bay Community School, which was for elementary age students, headed by an amazing woman named Sarah Shirion, and I taught in that school. The thing, and then when Rabbi Stu Kelman came to the Bay Area, he realized we needed midrashot everywhere. So he started one in Oakland and one in Contra Costa. So suddenly there was this intercongregational teen education all over the East Bay. The rabbis taught at least at the beginning. So you would have unaffiliated kids who were experiencing Orthodox rabbis. You would have Orthodox kids sitting next to Reform teens and suddenly realize that those teens took their Judaism as seriously as the more observant ones did. This communal working together spilled over to things like a community Leil Tikkun Shavuot, and there would be dancing at Berkeley High from everybody on Simchat Torah. The board members from different congregations became friends. The teens became friends. The rabbis became friends. So that was so unusual to me because I grew up in a world of silos where in order to go to my friends' Reform rabbis' high school program, I was required to get a permission slip from my conservative rabbi because he didn't want to think that he was poaching a teen from another congregation. And here everybody worked together. So that was the first radical thing. The second was that teen education became much more camp-like. When the Kelmans moved here in the early 80s, they had an 11th grader, an 8th grader, and 5th grade twins. And Stu looked around and realized what we were doing was a little boring. So he hired Ronnie Giller, who suddenly set up retreats. So kids could go away 4 times a year to a weekend that would re-envision their Judaism like the two of you were creating at camp. And they would be able to do it during the school year. Then they started adding value-added programs like an Israel trip just for kids in the East Bay. There were weekend backpacking trips. There was winter break social action and many more things. When faculty came to me, I would encourage them to teach whatever they were really, really passionate about and to see it through a Jewish lens. So the education became very relevant. It was whatever teens were already thinking about, but suddenly they began to see what Judaism thought about things like that. And over, teens used to say, this is the only time during my week where I get to be myself. And the last radical thing I think that we did was creating a long-lasting chevra of both faculty and students. Usually the word on the street from my colleagues around the country was you had a choice between either charismatic teachers who understood teens or teachers who were Jewishly knowledgeable. But in the Bay Area, we could get them both combined in the same person. And these people went on to form really tight chevras and to continue to be in touch with those people. And the same thing happened for the teens. And so you got both faculty and teens who went on to become rabbis, to become Jewish academics, to become Jewish professionals, to become Jewish lay leaders who became Jewish activists. And that's what I think we did.
Thank you all. Thank you all so much. I'm beginning to believe that there's hope for the future.
Mm-hmm.
Here again, some slides for your benefit. Our next conversation concerns adult Jewish education. In 1972, historian Fred Rosenbaum founded Lehrhaus Judaica, now Hamakom, and served as its director for 44 years. Israeli Reform Rabbi Miri Gold of Kibbutz Gezer achieved a historic precedent that provides Israeli government funding for non-Orthodox congregations in rural areas. David Leichman founded and ran Pinat Shorashim at Kibbutz Gezer, teaching about the role of Israel in the lives of diaspora Jews and the role of Judaism in the lives of Israeli Jews. And Noam Sion has been a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute since 1978, deeply involved in adult Jewish education throughout the United States and Israel. Fred, please.
Okay, thank you, Bradley. I don't think I would have made a almost half-century long career in Jewish education if it weren't for the RJU. Because when I arrived in Berkeley as a graduate student in German history, I saw in the RJU just people who were so passionate about Jewish life. Up till then, my Jewish education was very weak and my Jewish identity very faint, even though I grew up in a household where both my parents had immigrated from the shtetl. And I was in a community in Queens, New York, with included Holocaust survivors. Nevertheless, I didn't understand the meaning of Jewish life until I was part of the RJU. At the same time, I was very interested in the philosophy of Franz Rosenzweig. And it was only in the 60s and early 70s that some of his most important works were translated into English. And I saw that there could be a fertile field in the Bay Area for an adult school modeled on Rosenzweig's Lehrhaus in the 1920s in Frankfurt. In the RJU, I saw people who had entered Jewish life from many different pathways. Some were involved in the arts, some political activism. Zionism, of course, was so important, some through religious observance. And that Rosenzweig also had that multiplicity of pathways into Jewish life. And so I thought a school that would emphasize that would have a good chance of success in the Bay Area, especially among people of my generation. Just wanted to add something. The nature of the education would have to be through dialogue, through engagement. It was clear that the methods of even a Beit Midrash in a traditional sense was not what was called for at that time, not just learned men sitting around and studying the texts, important though that was. Also, I saw that I wanted an alternative to the university mode of education, something that didn't depend on grades and exams, degrees. The most important thing, what I got from Rosenzweig and what I saw from the RJU group was engagement, interest. I wanted people to just feel that they wanted to study this because they were interested in it. And that's really been my goal as a teacher, as an educator, just to get people involved, to get them engaged in the subject. In my case, it was just the dramatic arc of modern Jewish history. And so it was really two things that came together at the same time. The people I met day to day through the RJU and the philosophy of Franz Rosenzweig. Thank you.
Miri, you're on.
Oh, okay. Thank you for inviting me. It's a little bit ironic that I'm speaking about adult education. When I went to University of Michigan, all my friends were becoming teachers. And I said, I don't want to become a teacher. And they said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, I have no idea. So I ended up getting a BA in philosophy because it had the fewest required courses. And yet here I have turned into a rabbi who is always teaching. And I guess I found my niche. I never studied education or pedagogy. My encounter with adult education really evolved over the 20 years that I've been a congregational rabbi. Kilat Birkat Shalom is a reform congregation that is defined as a regional one, open to anybody who would like to come into our doors and find a warm and engaging way to express their Judaism. A major theme that has accompanied me throughout my years as a rabbi actually began after Yitzhak Rabin's assassination in November of 1995. A young man from Kibbutz Shalabim, which is not Kibbutz Dati, but rather Po'elei Agudat Yisrael, contacted me and said, you know what, we've got to create bridges between Jews of different philosophies and world outlooks. And he suggested that we study together. And we worked on a plan, and it's ironic that he never participated because those who came from Shalabim, who were in many ways very open and part of the modern world, weren't comfortable without having a rabbi from the Kiryat Chinuch that was part of Greater Shalabim. And that was really a shame, but we did get together Jews from Gezer who were not necessarily affiliated with the denomination, but clearly were liberal, and very nice, wonderful people from Shalabim. What I learned there is that we had very different ways of looking at things. We respected one another, and in some cases, I'd say we tolerated each other's differences. And that's a theme that has carried through with me for all these years, realizing that if we want to get to pluralism, and there is no one word in Hebrew for pluralism, it comes out pluralism sometimes, ribui drachim, or drachim rabot maybe, we first need to tolerate one another. And in Hebrew, the word for tolerance is sovlanut, which comes from the root sevel, which means to suffer. And of course, we can think of the word tolerate in different ways. Sometimes we cannot tolerate a food or a medicine. Sometimes it's painful to tolerate something. But I think that in Israel, we have a real challenge to tolerate one another's differences. And as David next to me said in a movie, give me the right to be wrong. And I have seen that it's not a two-way street, but it is something that we must work on. So over the years, whether it's been talking to diaspora Jews and telling them to tolerate the way that Israel moves so slowly in the world of tolerance and openness and change, or whether it's with Arab and Jewish relationships or other interfaith work, I think that we have a goal that we're getting to slowly, which is to have more tolerance with an ability to break through, to appreciate and celebrate other people's differences.
David, please.
I actually wound up in Berkeley after having been a Jewish educator in Hillel and working with the Jewish Agency because of both Ken and Bradley. That's how I wound up there. And I became the director of Young Judea for Northern California, Washington, Oregon, Utah, Nevada, and joined the Garin that they were in to come to Gezer, which I did in 1976 to a pretty new kibbutz at the time. In fact, I was the 29th member and Miri was the 30th member of Gezer at that point. And I had always been working with college students until I came here. And then I wound up doing all kinds of different things in Jewish education, working with Wujis, which to me was an amazing experience, Wujis in Arad, because everybody who was there wanted to study. There were no tests, there were no exams, there were no grades. It was people who came to study Judaism. And that was the beginning more of adult Jewish education for me. And then I went on shlichut, and I was a shliach in Boston for almost 3 years, doing working on the college campuses in Boston, in the New England area. And then when I came back to Israel, I actually Ken, and I thank Ken a lot for this. He was asked to work for the Chevra Lekanat Teva, and turned it down and turned to me and said, would you want to do this? And I did it for a short while and realized that what I want to do is, when I came back from shlichut, is to continue my shlichut, but in Israel with people from the diaspora, which later led to many, many Israelis as well. And what I started this thing called Pinat Shorashim, which started from scratch. It was all, I called it a learning laboratory, no different than a science laboratory that has sinks and microscopes and so on. But in the many different tools that you have, you start to do different experiments. And I started with working with children, coming in, high school kids from America and so on. And it led into many adult groups as a learning laboratory, where people would come and work. Fred mentioned engagement, which I think is one of the keys of what I was trying to do, to engage people. Miri talked about the different, or others also about different sects of Judaism. And what we wanted to do is have a Judaism where anybody whose last name was Jewish. We also worked with a lot of non-Jews, but the majority of it was people who were working, who were wanting to learn more about Judaism. I worked with a lot of federations. I worked with a lot of with JNF groups that came, with Hillel groups that came, many educators from abroad who came, and in each time they were doing things with their hands. We said that we wanted to have them leave their legacy while reclaiming our roots, and that's Pinat Shorashim. One of the examples that I would use, we had about 15 different areas which were built by people who were involved in building this park, which was empty and later became a very beautiful garden and park and nature and environment, and our roots of words, roots of shorashim of words, shorashim of our yadut, and shorashim of the plants. So, and a lot of building went on, but all done by people who came to work there to find an engagement. We were about a pluralistic Judaism. It didn't matter whether your Judaism was Orthodox Jewish, Reform Jewish, Kibbutz Jewish, Diaspora Jewish. It really didn't matter because we wanted to be able to be open to anybody who uses Jewish as their last name. And one of the things that we did, just as one example of the many different areas that we had, was a Havdalah corner. And what we were trying to teach was Havdalim, not that Havdalah is the separation, but the distinction between different things, between Or L'choshech, Yisrael Ba'amim, Yom Shvi, V'sheshet Yamei Maseh, and so on and so forth. Because the idea was to really change the way in which we look at our Judaism. We had many groups who would come through because we're at Gezer, close to the airport. Either they would leave from Gezer and go to from Pinat Shorashim to the airport, or vice versa, and have breakfast when they came. And the whole idea basically was we started something about Havdalah ben Kodesh l'chul, and making the distinction, not that Eretz Yisrael is kadosh and chul is outside of Israel, but rather how do we bring the things that were kadosh to you and bring them to your colleagues, to your students, whatever, in Chutz La'aretz. And that was basically one example that we had, and lots of others that were similar to that.
Okay, and now last but never least, Noam.
50 years ago, I wasn't Noam Sion, I was Noam Sachs. When I got married, I took my wife's name. And 50 years ago, I wasn't in the RJU. I was on the other side of the country in the New York Chavurah. But at the same time, you were taking over, having a sit-in in your federation. We were having a sit-in in the New York Federation, both for pushing issues of education, and both because both the San Francisco and New York federations were then dominated by German Jews, for whom, as Shelley put it very nicely, the question of making it in America was a lot more important than creating a uniquely Jewish point of view. Now, the specific part that I want to talk about is a project I've been involved with for many years, which was the Haggadah, called the Family Participation Haggadah, A Different Night. And in a moment, I'll ask Racheli if she can share a picture of that, because the picture will speak more than all of my words. And the idea of that Family Participation Haggadah was part of my critique of my father's synagogue, in fact, of all synagogue life, which we saw as bourgeois, that was fundamentally built on the difference between clergy and laity, of course, a category taken from the Catholics, not a Jewish term whatsoever, that involved the passivity as well as the ignorance of the people who were as well as the ignorance of the people sitting in the pews, and they liked it that way. And the rabbis would do everything. It was a ritual performance in a Protestant style, usually wearing a long cloak. And the idea of the Haggadah was to try to create a notion of participation where you didn't have to be a rabbi or a professor or a chazan in order to participate and create your own Seder. To do that, we put as the picture of A Different Night. We took an old German artist in the Art Nouveau style, that is Otto Geismar, and we had to artificially fix the people at the table. As a good German Seder that he was describing, you had an old man with a beard telling everybody else and reading to them. So we had to change some of the men into women. We had to have everybody with their hands up and having a conversation, because part of the revolution of the Family Participation Haggadah was a continuation, of course, of the whole Earth catalog from the 60s, and then the Jewish catalog from the 70s, which were all based on the principle that you wanted to create a do-it-yourself community without a hierarchical structure, in which the body was part of it, the doing was part of it, not the dogma. Ritual became something that was alive and personal and customized. And therefore, we created a Haggadah that would allow people to have a pluralist Seder, to make their Seder each time and customize it in their own way. So we also were critical of things like, was mentioned earlier, the Freedom Seder Haggadah of Art Waskow, because it was very much a partisan Haggadah that could be participated in only with people with a very specific political point of view. I know how much my father hated that Haggadah when I read to them, and this is what Rabbi Eldridge Cleaver of the Black Power movement has to teach us. Our Haggadah would be pluralist, in which people would pick and choose and delegate and customize. The key principle was that religion is not a matter of your beliefs or only of your ritual practices. Religion is part of the making of meaning, and meaning is something you do for yourself, and that's what makes the meaning for you. And I believe that this model of a homemade Judaism done at home can help during a period of the radical decline of synagogues, at the same time the restructuring and also the weakening of families, and the creation of a resource that allows people to create their own families, however defined, their own communities, and to create and constantly recreate every single year. So we'll end with the second picture, Racheli, of my wife Marcella's, whose name I took, her Haggadah, that is her Seder plate, that for the Corona period, as an example of how you customize your own Seder. We'll see whether we come up with the picture of it. And there it is, and you can see it's a Seder plate, and on it you have an ambulance for taking people to the hospital. You have alcohol, which is our form of cleaning your hands. You have Corona beer bottle. You have the limitation of how you walk. You have from Chad Gadya, the Malach HaMavet, the angel of death. All of these are ways in which every year you have to recreate your Judaism to reflect what's relevant and to put it into a Jewish context. Let's stop with that.
Brad, I just have a quick comment. I know we're running late in this segment, but
sure, you're doing fine. You're doing fine.
As we've all been talking, I think I see what ties us all together is that we've all been trying to democratize Jewish learning in one form or another. And I think, just to underline what David and Miri were saying, how important it is to have the students coming from all different backgrounds, That's been one of the real rewards of Jewish education for me, is to have people of all different ages, adults of all ages. And so they bring their life experience to bear in the learning process, And
exactly. And
the dialogue.
If I may step out of the moderator's role for just a second, I have to say that my feeling has been through this whole experience, if I may borrow a phrase, Mikol Milamdai Hiskalti. I have learned from all of you tremendously, and not only over all of the past 50 years, but also today. And let's see, do we have some slides here? Yes, here we go.
Yeah, there you see the first catalog of Lehrhaus. My colleague Jahan Grist is a lower left. That was from around the late 1980s. But in that first semester, we had, David Moss was teaching calligraphy. We had people who just went on to become leading scholars as well. But the main thing is that we had people who, just on their own had mastered this material and were teaching others, and people who were just starting out, like Steve Rosen in maybe in a semester that followed this. That was also in the mode of Rosenzweig. I just conclude with this. He said that it's when you have a real Lehrhaus when the students and the student and teacher exchange places in the classroom, and it's that emphasis on dialogue, I think, that has really been the goal of Lehrhaus now Hamakom. Thank you.
That's right, and that phrase about learning from everyone. I learned from all my teachers, ends with and even more from my students.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so next, and I guess this leads directly into this, in fact, a conversation on university Jewish studies. Historian David Beal is the Emanuel Ringelbaum is distinguished professor of Jewish studies at UC Davis, taught also at SUNY Binghamton and at the Graduate Theological Union. Steve Rosen has been a professor of archaeology at Ben Gurion University in Beersheba since 1988, and has also served as the university's vice president and deputy rector. Gentlemen, please.
All right, I think I'll start. So this event has actually made me revisit my own Jewish education. And like Sherman, Hebrew school was a total failure for me. I got kicked out a few times until finally I kicked myself out. It would be worth doing a study of how many professors of Jewish studies also failed at Hebrew school. Like Sherman and Ken and others who have spoken, it was summer camp that had the biggest effect on me, first as a camper at the Brandeis Bardeen camp in Southern California, later as a counselor with Sherman and Noam at the Hashachar camp, then with Ken and Bradley and Rachel Beal at the Machane Bonim in the Catskills. So all of that was crucial in terms of turning me towards a Jewish identity. But I want to speak just for a moment about Jewish education and the Radical Jewish Union, since it hasn't been mentioned. One might get the impression that all we did was sit in and produce a newspaper, and we did those things, but we also actually created a kind of alternative Jewish community in Berkeley. Those were the years when Hillel was essentially moribund. Jewish studies on the campus was rudimentary at best. And so we undertook to create our own kind of self-starting, it's what Noam Sion just spoke about, self-starting Jewish community without leaders. It was totally egalitarian, and we undertook to educate ourselves. We had chugim of all kinds. Jane Rubin, who's here with us today, ran a Jewish philosophy chug. Ken Bob, a Zionism chug. I still remember trying together with Tzvi White to read Chaim Nachman Bialik's incredibly difficult essay, Kisui v'Gilui Balashon, Revelation and Concealment in Language. It was a very, very exciting time to be actually educating ourselves. And at a certain point in my, when I was active in the RJU from 1970 to 72, I suddenly realized, why can't I combine what I'm so passionate about off campus with what I'm doing on campus? I was a history major. And so I did, and I went into the field of Jewish studies. That's where I met Fred Rosenbaum. We were the only two graduate students in the Berkeley history department interested in Jewish history. We taught each other. We also studied with a very eccentric historian of Italy, Richard Webster, who was an amateur Jewish historian. But I had no idea when I was doing that there would be any actual career outcome. This is a time when Jewish studies, you could name on the fingers maybe of two hands the universities that had more than one teacher of Jewish studies, maybe even fewer. And the field was really in its infancy. The Association for Jewish Studies had maybe a couple hundred members. Today, it's got 1,800 members. The field is completely exploded. There isn't a university, a self-respecting university, I would say, in this country, in the United States, that does not have a Jewish studies program of some kind. And that, I think, is a remarkable development. We can go into the history of why that happened. Obviously, communal support made a big difference. Donations from donors, but also universities recognize that here is a really important and legitimate field. What we tried to do, and certainly in the positions I've been in, was to integrate Jewish studies into the curriculum, so that when I taught at SUNY Binghamton, I resisted some of my colleagues who wanted to create a separate department of Jewish studies. I said, no, we should be teaching in the departments, in the history department, the religious studies department, and that's been my philosophy to this day. Jewish studies at the university level in the United States has actually played, I think, a very important role in Jewish identity. There was a study done at Brandeis University some years ago that claimed that about 40% of Jewish students take at least one course in Jewish studies at the university. So it's playing a role there at that level, especially since a lot of students arrive with at best pediatric Judaism, and they're ready for something that is much more sophisticated and on a higher level. At the same time, I would say that my colleagues and I, with some exceptions, do not see our role as promoting Jewish identity. If people want to use it for that purpose, we're happy to provide the resources, but that is not our purpose in teaching in the universities in this field. The other thing I want to suggest, it was very interesting development, is the number of non-Jewish students who take our courses. At UC Davis, where I teach now, without a doubt, the vast majority of my students are not Jewish. It's their only exposure, probably, to Jewish history, Jewish culture. And I think that's also an enormous service that we're providing. I want to conclude by referring to another person who's spoken today. I've had wonderful graduate students who are teaching at prestigious universities all over the country. But in many ways, I am most proud of Peg Sandell, who did a PhD with me and is putting into effect in a very, very convincing and exciting way the principles that I've always held to in Jewish education. Steve, over to you.
Thank you, David. Okay, a couple of preliminary remarks. The role that the RJU played in everything afterwards is unmeasurable in my life. I went to Berkeley because of the RJU, and then I continued. It's impossible, and I ended up at Machane Bonim because of Kent and RJ and the RJU, and I ended up in Israel because of all of that. But this is kind of a major impact. The other thing I want to note is, okay, we've gone back to teaching frontally in Israel, and for those of you who may have forgotten, students have an entire body beneath the shoulders. And furthermore, they're three-dimensional. It's amazing after almost a year and a half of teaching to recognize that there are actually human beings behind that screen. And I cannot express to you the pure joy of teaching properly again. I'm absolutely serious. It's just unbelievable now to be able to exchange with a student who's only 2 meters away, 6 feet, for those of you who are unacquainted with the metric system. Okay, now to the points at hand. David made a crucial point about the role of Jewish education in American universities vis-a-vis Jewish students, and that's the role of identity. And that's not a role that is played in that exists in Israeli universities. My job, by the way, is to take the Israeli version, the Israeli side here. Israeli culture, which some people draw this contrast between Israeli culture and Jewish culture, and that's wrong. That's fundamentally wrong. Even if Israelis will claim they're not Jewish, but they're Israeli, that's a fundamental misunderstanding. It's like saying there's a difference between Mizrahi Jews and Ashkenazi Jews, or American Jews and French Jews. Israeli culture has become a version of Judaism, a secular version of Judaism. But I want to point out here, and we'll get to the university part in a second, that everybody speaks Hebrew here. You can't avoid it. Everybody learns Bible in high school intensively. The entire rhythm of life here is set by the Jewish holidays. If we could achieve that in other Jewish cultures overseas, that would be an incredible success. So it's a little bit, the role of the university education, Jewish education here, is very much what David sees his own role as. University Jewish education in Israel is research oriented, it's academic. It plays very little role in Jewish identity. I don't know if that's good or bad, but there's another point to be taken here. I've written this down and now I can't find it, but the number of departments in my university, I'm at Ben-Gurion University, the number of departments that deal in one way or another with Jewish knowledge. We have a Department of Jewish History. We have a Department of Israel Studies. We have a Department of Jewish Literature. We have a Department of Hebrew Literature. We have a Department of Jewish Philosophy. We have a department, which has now been merged with Jewish Philosophy, of Bible. We have a Department of Hebrew Language. These are all, now that's an incredible multiplication of things that in most places in the world would be lumped into kind of one or two departments. And Ben-Gurion is not unusual here. All of the Israeli universities have this. Why? And here we get into the politicization of Jewish identity in this country. These are all supported by government funds. Now, I'm not objecting to this. I'm just trying to explicate the point. We have here an academic Jewish education system as opposed to what I would call a more grassroots, which I described earlier, which is supported as a part of the basic support for the humanities, or maybe in some ways at the expense of the other humanities. And the donors, and this is another crucial point, I'm checking my time, and I'll finish in a second, a lot of that support comes from overseas donors. Because people overseas and all the Israeli universities, all of them, raise tens of millions of dollars from their overseas supporters, and that was one of my jobs. This is kind of flagship for a lot of the donors to promote Jewish identity in Israel. So there's an interesting and important contrast in the way in the roles that Jewish education or post-secondary Jewish education plays in the two countries, and that's I'll leave it at that.
I just wanted to say one thing in response to Steve. Having taught in two Israeli universities as a visiting professor, Haifa and Hebrew University, one of the things that was really striking to me is I had classes that included both, religious students and totally secular students. And a number of the students said to me, this is the first time actually in my university career that I'm actually talking to people who are different from me. And what I concluded from that is that because I was a visitor, I sort of freed them up to do what they wouldn't normally do in the regular Israeli university class. So I thought that was very interesting. University ought to be a place where you meet people who are different and get to know them and exchange views. It doesn't seem to happen as much in Israeli universities as one would like.
One has to remember at this point that there's a deep polarization in this country. And the polarization between orthodoxy and not modern orthodoxy and secular Judaism. And one also has to remember, of course, that students here are older. Students here, a standard first-year student at an Israeli university is 23 years old. And that's the average age. So.
Okay, let me show these.
Okay, as we watch our slides go by, allow me to tell you that our final conversation will address Jewish early childhood education. Janet Harris has extensive pioneering experience in the field. She's been director since 2007 of the Early Childhood Initiative for the Jewish Community Federation. Rachel Beal has worked in the Bay Area Jewish community since the late 80s, including as a clinical consultant with Jewish preschools, often in collaboration with Janet Harris. Janet?
Okay. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see all of you. So all this talk about research and how people learn is so perfect for early childhood education. And I actually want to start with a quote by Albert Einstein, who said, "Understanding the theory of relativity is child's play compared to understanding child's play." He also said, "Play is the highest form of research." And early childhood education, which started out as sort of a hobby for people to get a few hours away from their kids, frankly, has really grown and developed into a very serious academic field. And lots of the themes that we've been listening to today are just very, very central to quality early childhood Jewish education. And one of them is meaning making. And we were talking before about prior experience of the learner. Children who come to preschool have prior experiences. One of the basic tenets of early childhood education is that children come full of knowledge and wisdom and beliefs and nourishkeit and the whole package. But they come as a full, whole person. And the teacher becomes their partner in learning, becomes their milava, their guide. And it, rather than the old way of early childhood education, which was that the teacher had this great idea to do a craft that will then be thrown away as soon as the kids go to bed and the parents can put it in the trash. Now the curriculum is co-created by children and teachers and parents to create meaning. And what it looks like now is outdoor Jewish education from age 2, any weather, where the children and the teachers and the parents are discovering, wonderful things in nature that lead to their theories. We also have been heavily influenced by the Reggio Emilia movement, which I know is very popular in Israel as well. Reggio Emilia is a province in Italy that puts children as co-creators of their life and respect children as citizens of the world. And as we work in early childhood education now, there are 36 Jewish preschools in the Bay Area. There is childcare all day so that working parents can actually go to work. There is parent participation. And mostly the thing that is so powerful about a Jewish early childhood education experience is the bond that parents create with one another. And that's something that we're focusing on in our work, is how do we give over the power to parents to create their communities without the authority figure necessarily of a teacher or director? How do we really do tzimtzum so that all the learners in our environment can show up and take agency? And that's what Jewish early childhood education is about. It's about the children, it's about the parents, it's about the teachers. We're all on this learning path together. And many of our Jewish early childhood programs in the Bay Area, really, they're known nationally for their innovation, for their care. And there's something else that happens in early childhood we need to learn from as children and families move up in the educational realm. And that is joy. Joy cannot be underrated in what we do with students, with parents, with teachers. It is in such short supply. And early childhood Jewish education presents us with the opportunity to really tap into what being joyful is with one another and to create community with those common experiences. And I feel really lucky. I started out as a preschool teacher and thought of myself as an early childhood educator until I met now the infamous or famous Stu Kelman and Vicki Kelman. They've been referred to several times here, but really through my work with Stu and Vicki, my identity changed from an early childhood educator to a Jewish educator who works in early childhood education. And I'm forever grateful to them for helping me go on that path. But I would say that the whole concept of meaning making, which other forms of education are just realizing now, has been very prominent in early childhood education. And that children, from the time they're born, deserve the ultimate respect because they're whole people. And it's really the beginning of their Jewish life. And as I say often, Jewish early childhood education, it's great for the kids, but it's better for the parents. And it's our job as early childhood Jewish educators to help parents make meaning as well. It's often young parents' first opportunity to be in a Jewish setting as a family. And we know from research that it has a huge impact on the family's Jewish trajectory. I also want to mention that yesterday, May 1st, we know that May Day is a big day for some of us. And what you probably don't know is that May Day is Worthy Wage Day. And that's a movement that was started in Berkeley by Marcy Whitebook at UC Berkeley, who studies childcare employment. And one of the struggles and challenges that we're working on is professionalizing the field so that we have the best educators getting professional salaries. So that's my political statement for the day. It's kind of something that I have been Mishugala Devar about for pretty much my entire career of 4.5 decades.
Great. So because we are running late, I'm not going to add much except to say that on May Day in my early childhood, we marched around the kibbutz with red flags and sang the International. I do want to add that my work together with Janet, which started really in the early 90s with when I was a clinician at Jewish Family and at the time Family Service, now Jewish Family and Community Services of the East Bay, in working together with all of the early childhood and religious school programs to bring in more psychological insight, intervention. So I just will tell a very brief story and then end. I was asked to come to a preschool where there was a 4-year-old boy who had been very adventurous on the climbing structure and suddenly stopped climbing on the climbing structures. And the teachers knew enough to know that there's something going on, but they couldn't figure it out. I talked to the parents, I talked to the teachers. It turned out that his grandfather, who he didn't know well, had died recently, and somewhere he heard that Grandpa went to heaven. So he was no longer climbing up to the top because he was afraid that he was going to bump into Grandpa's feet. So that was something that came on in the 80s, but most so robustly in the 90s, of integrating early childhood development and psychological support into the early childhood basket of offerings in the Bay Area. And we'll move on to the last part.
You want to share the screen?
No, there's no screen.
Okay. There we are. Just a moment here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. In our next segment, we'll take a brief look at historical perspectives and future trends. Ari Kelman was going to be with us. He cannot be with us today. Professor of Education and Jewish Studies at Stanford. But we very warmly welcome Wayne Feinstein, who began his career as a Jewish community professional in the 1970s, including 18 years as CEO of the Detroit, Los Angeles, and then the San Francisco Jewish Federations. Wayne, please.
Thanks very much. In the interest of time, I'll keep this brief. I was fascinated to revisit many of your biographies, members of the panel, and a few with whom I did work closely over quite a few years. But I had the following observations in an effort to sort of wrap this together. All of us on the panel are baby boomers at one end or the far end of that age range. And we grew up in a period of 60s radicalization. And the RJU, as was noted by Shelley Schroeder at the beginning, certainly grew out of that milieu. And all of us had a conviction, no matter what we subsequently did professionally, by the time we got to college, that we were going to challenge establishments in every possible way. And certainly RJU members did that. And so many of you on the panel and others not on the panel led careers that, as we've heard in the last 90 minutes, really made huge change in the Jewish community. I'm a few years younger than most of you. I was not in San Francisco in '71 when you sat in at 220 Bush Street, but I knew the late Mel Swig and others of the German Jewish aristocracy of the Jewish community at that time, and they were adamantly opposed to parochial Jewish education. But at the point that I came to San Francisco, brought here 6 months after his tenure began by Rabbi Brian Lurie, who was for 18 years the executive of the San Francisco Jewish Federation, there was change afoot in the professional cadre and in the lay leadership of the Jewish Federation. And even people like Mel of blessed memory or Richard Goldman of blessed memory or others of that milieu and that era wanted the change. I can't say definitively that it was because of the sit-in that their minds were opened, but there was no doubt, if you look over the span of Jewish life in the San Francisco Bay Area in the 1970s, which was coterminous with my own tenure at the San Francisco Jewish Federation as a youngster at the time, we made enormous difference and change. The philosophy that we brought to both fundraising and funding was radically different than what had preceded it, say, up till about 1972, 1973. So by the end of the 70s, I actually sat on the board of what was then called Brandeis Hillel Day School in order to try to effect the merger. Otherwise, we would have had two struggling Jewish day schools that went under completely. And we had begun to provide meaningful support, both from the annual campaign and from endowments. By the time I was leaving, in fact, many of those very same people who had opposed parochial Jewish education had both in their annual support of the Jewish Federation program and allocations, but in their private foundation philanthropy had become major supporters of university Jewish education, of Jewish day schools, believe it or not, of Jewish camps, Jewish summer camps, of teen programs. And so in general, I think that period was seminal in terms of whatever flowering there has been in the American Jewish community, and we can all recite the litany of challenges that we still face in 2021. But as a practical matter, I think what you see in annual funding today is in the millions of dollars for everything from Jewish preschool through university education, from annual campaign and endowment funds. And I think that will go from strength to strength. One other observation, in the years subsequent, there were a number of dedicated programs of adult Jewish learning, oftentimes created outside the Bay Area. For example, the Wexner Heritage Foundation put in millions of dollars into the San Francisco Bay Area Jewish community to train a cadre of today probably 60 lay and professional leaders in this Jewish community. Danny Grossman, the current Federation executive, and I, then the Federation executive in San Francisco, both participated actively in that program. These kinds of things have really changed the way organized Jewish communal life in Northern California, and I would submit in most of the major metropolitan Jewish communities in America operate today. So thank you for putting this together. Thank you for inviting me to participate. I've enjoyed it and learned a lot.
Thank you, Wayne. So I'd now like to invite Rabbi Ruth Adar, Executive Director of Hamakom, for closing remarks. And after Ruth, we're going to open things up for about 10 minutes of question and answer, moderated by Sue Fishkoff of Jay, the newspaper of Northern California. Please, Ruth.
There we go. No? Yes, there we go. So sorry for the little technical glitch there. This is such a remarkable assembly of revolutionary Jewish educators. You have collectively made a profound difference in Jewish education, and I am so grateful. We at Hamakom, the place, are your heirs, and we honor this heritage. To the making of meaning, there is no limit. As Noam Zion just said, every year we recreate Judaism. And I think it is safe to say that the revolution continues. We welcome programs like this, and we're so glad that all of you are here to share them. I look forward to the questions. Programs like this are possible because our donors support them with gifts both small and large. If you'd like to support this kind of programming, you can do so at hmqm.org/support. But we are very, very grateful to have all of you here. And I count so many of you among my teachers. I'm just felling here. It's wonderful.
And now, thank you very much, Rabbi Adar. We would like to go to Sue Fishkoff, and this ends the formal presentations of our program, but we'd like to go and do some questions and answers for those of you who have questions for our speakers.
Thank you very much, Bradley. This was a fascinating discussion. And I'm going to ask you all to put your questions, if you have them, in chat. And I'd like to start with one of my own. This Zoominar dealt with all of the major aspects of Jewish education except one. And that's what we used to call Hebrew school, right? The part-time, non-immersive, after school, what the heck do we now call it? Jewish education. The educational options that you have discussed, primarily camp, day school, require a certain level of commitment, of time, of money. What is the responsibility of the American Jewish community towards revamping, reintegrating, revitalizing some kind of part-time Jewish education for the next generation? I'd like to address that to those of you who work with American Jewish children, maybe Peg Sandell, Diane Birnbaum. Anybody want to take it on?
Diane, do you want to go for that?
I'll just start briefly. I think that a lot of the education that we talked about and making things relevant has trickled down to the elementary level. And then there are a plethora of interesting new programs like ADA that was started in Berkeley that's now under the umbrella of Studio 70, which takes K through fifth graders and tries to do intensive Jewish education after school, but making it as exciting as camp was. Wilderness Torah takes kids at that age. Urban Adamah has programs. So there are a lot of non-traditional programs that are happening now with students from that age. And I've been retired for 7 years, so I'm sure there's a lot going on that I don't know about.
Great. Somebody else have input? Peg, you want to have some input there?
I would just say one thing. You know, I'm clearly on the day school side because I think the integrated approach is powerful. But I would say we're living in an era of opt-in Judaism, and there are lots and lots of things in our community, Jewish and especially broadly, that pull on kids and parents' attention. And so anything the Jewish community puts forward has to be, mediocrity can no longer stand. And so it has to be engaging, it has to be relevant. And if excellence is our standard, then we stand a chance of winning that competition in the attention marketplace.
Great. Okay. There is a question here from Tamar Zaken. And it's to everyone. What are your thoughts on our current activists who are working to highlight and strengthen the voices of Jews of color and Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews? What can we learn from the RJU, the Radical Jewish Union activists, for this new struggle for Jewish inclusion? Nice. Speakers? Nobody?
Just as because there are so many speakers on the panel, everybody is very modest and allowing other people to step in. So I think, Sue, maybe you could call on somebody.
You call,
okay.
Well, I don't know.
Are you still on? Deborah Newborn, are you still on?
Yes, I'm here. I'm here.
Yeah.
You want me to respond to the question about the voices of Jews of color, Sephardi and Mizrahi? I think with Ilana Kaufman and the Jewish, the project that she's running, I forget the title exactly. I think what we're starting to uncover is there are many more Jews of color than we recognize, that they are, like the Black Lives Matter movement, stepping forward to say we need to be included. We need to not be asked when we come up to shul, how do we become a Jew? Who are we here to see? That sort of inclusion. I think that our programming has to start to be very actively outreaching in our marketing materials, and even the spots we save in very popular programs, that we want to make sure that we don't just tokenize people on the margins, but we include enough numbers so they don't have to speak for their kind, but they just get to be among the population.
Great, thank you very much. There are a couple of people who have their hands raised, their virtual hands raised. Could you please go into the chat and write your question? And meanwhile, I have another question, maybe for some of the Israel education people. I'm interested in knowing, in the Jewish day school movement in this country, how much American Jewish history is taught. It seems to me, I mean, as far as I know, the Israel experience is still privileged in American Jewish education as a way of strengthening Jewish identity. And I wonder if anyone like Noam or Sherman might have something to say about that. And I'd also like to hear from someone in American Jewish education how much American Jewish history is being taught to our kids.
I could just mention one thing that came over on the internet a few days ago, and that is that the Israeli television has now a new program exactly on this topic for Israelis. It's basically looking at the diversity of what it means to be a Jew in America. I haven't seen it, it's just coming out, but I think this is a topic which is very pertinent now in Israel.
Maybe that could be subtitled and shown in this country. Anyone else want to take that on?
I would just say, in K through 8 Jewish day schools, American Jewish history, things like the Jewish involvement in the gold rush. When fourth graders are studying California history, they're looking at the impact of the gold rush on American Jewish communities. Also looking at the history of synagogue building and things like that. So it's woven in. to history lessons at all grades. And then in the high school level, you see a much more specialized focus on specific topics, including Jews of color and the Mizrahi Sephardi experience. All of those sort of more specialized topics get woven into Jewish history courses at the Jewish Community High School, as well as Kehila Jewish High School.
Good. One more question here from Yossi Fendel. For Jewish studies folks and maybe those working in adult education, how has the immediate access to texts through apps like Sefaria changed things? Be Fred or David.
Yeah, I don't think it's changed anything exactly. I mean, certainly one of our approaches at the university level is to make texts directly available to students, so that they're not only, reading textbooks or secondary sources, but engaging with Jewish sources. I'm not sure that specific apps are making any difference, but certainly the availability of primary sources in English now is very rich. There's an enormous number of possibilities there, and so we try to use those.
Yeah, I would just say that Zoom has changed a lot. Maybe just say a word about that. I think that what Steve Rosen said is certainly very true, that it's not the same in-person experience. And since I was speaking about dialogue and student-teacher interaction, obviously it's not the same thing. However, it has really brought in so many more people that otherwise couldn't participate. I'm finding that in my classes that I've got students now from everywhere from Massachusetts to New Zealand. And even within the Bay Area, there are so many people who, they live in Marin and they don't want to drive to Berkeley. The traffic is bad. They don't have the time, or if they live in the peninsula, they don't, want to go someplace, in the East Bay to Contra Costa. So I think it just broadens, the base so much that's a very big advantage that has to be taken into account. So maybe it comes back to this democratizing Jewish learning.
And I just want to pop in on that, sort of looking to the next 20 years and looking at most of the faces here. So we are approaching the next 2 or 3 decades of our life where we will be less mobile. And I think Zoom has forced us to recognize that there's a whole segment of the older and physically limited population, people with disabilities as well, that would be a very important area for the Jewish community to invest resources in, so that people who can't travel for whatever reason can access all of these educational and cultural opportunities.
Yes, Sue, please.
I just wanted to close out my section, then I'll throw it back to you, Bradley, sure, with a little advertisement about the democratization of Jewish learning, Jewish education in California. Finally, after 10 years as editor of J, I have begun digitizing our archives, our publication back to thank you, Fred, back to 1895. We have seed money now for that project from the Lisa and Douglas Goldman Fund. We're still looking for more funding. It is the microfilms are being scanned as we speak, and by July we should have from 1895 through the 1930s online for everybody. So there will be more on that to come.
Okay.
Thanks, Bradley.
Actually, we're also just
thank you so much, Sue. Thank you so much, Sue. I want to say it's not every day that you pick up and move forward a conversation that began a half a century ago. And there is clearly enough to talk about for the next 50 years. I want to just express tremendous gratitude to all the organizers, to all the speakers, and especially to all of those of you who tuned in and made such great comments in the course of this, even that it was heartwarming, especially it was kind of a color war going on with the camps. And I think it's a great thing. I think it's a wonderful thing to see that we want to do something about the future. This is not about the past. It's not about what happened 50 years ago. It's about what happens now. And I am tremendously heartened by what I heard today. So be well, everyone. Be well.